Welcome back to Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight I'm talking with Hunter Wagenaar. He is a third year at University of Virginia, and tonight our subject is going to be more inclusive sex education, a topic that should be of interest to all of us. Thank you so much, Hunter, for being here.
Thank you, Catherine.
So let's start at the beginning about how you came up with this idea that there was an unmet need for more inclusive sex education and what you have done to date to kind of roll out a solution for this.
Yeah, so essentially during the second half of my first year, I was part of this course called Black LGBTQ Literature. And essentially the last part of our course, we had to create a project on an issue that was impacting the LGBTQ community as a whole. And that's when I focused on LGBTQ inclusive sexual education in public schools. And the research I found was staggering. And only 9 states in the United States is LGBTQ inclusive sexual education mandated by law. And in the rest of the states, it's sort of just a free-for-all. And then I started to think about sort of the personal impact that this had on me growing up gay and not having the information that I needed given to me in school. It not only made me more paranoid about sexually transmitted diseases, but it also had an effect upon my mental health. I didn't feel as validated because I wasn't being talked about.
So you bring up something really important, which is what is the impact on young people's mental and physical health when they go through life not having evidence-based, medically accurate information about sex, sexually transmitted diseases? I mean, what kind of peril do you feel like we're putting our students in?
I mean, generally, most students will rely on other sources which are inaccurate. So they'll go to older peers, they'll go to pornography, they'll go to other sites on the internet that aren't medically accurate and can lead to a lot of just general anxiety about engaging in intercourse. And it shouldn't be this stressful affair. We should be giving kids the tools and devices that they need and the knowledge they need to be able to lead healthy lives.
You know, it's interesting because we are a very diverse community here in Northern Virginia. I know you went to Robinson High School. And so there are actually school board members on our current Fairfax County Public School Board who believe that our sex education, our family, they call it family life education, should be opt-in. This is problematic because every culture deals with these subjects differently. And so if cultures or within families, they decide that they don't want to address these issues, you have students going into adolescence with no information. You know, the concept of opting in assumes that every family is taking responsibility for giving accurate information to their children. Do you think that's happening?
No, I really don't think it is. And you bring up a really interesting fact with the school board. Fairfax County is one of the most progressive counties in the country regarding sexual education. But recently what we've seen is one individual running for school board in the most recent election started to call LGBTQ inclusive sex ed in Fairfax County sodomy. You know,
so out of touch.
What you see is a societal mindset that's sort of stuck in the 1800s. You see a sexual education curriculum with our pregnancy videos or other videos stuck in the 1980s. And you see children stuck in limbo because they're not being given the knowledge they need.
Right. So you have actually a very interesting statistic about, well, you tell us what 2 things you remember from your sex education classes.
Yeah. So what I remember and what most of my peers remember, if you ask them, are not sexually transmitted disease prevention. It's not how to use a condom. It's not what forms of birth control there are. It's the pregnancy video, which has no relevance to me as a gay man. And then it's also the testicular self-examination video.
Which we agree is important.
It's important.
It's important.
And testicular cancer is higher among male adolescents. But then if you look at it, the rates of testicular cancer among male adolescents, according to the CDC, are 0.2%. But then if you look at the rates of gonorrhea and chlamydia, which are now becoming antibiotic resistant, so can become life-threatening, it's 2% among the male adolescent population.
And there's radio silence on that.
There really is. I mean, the other issue is within these schools, teachers sort of have the leeway to teach whatever they want in relation to these topics. And although we are one of the most progressive counties, we're also one of the most academically competitive. So if a teacher has to go, oh, I'm going to decide between teaching sexual education or history for the SOL, I'm going to choose history for the SOL. But what matters more in 5 years to the student? Whether they know how to use a condom and prevent pregnancy, or whether they know if George Washington was the first president. I mean, that's a very important
things are
informational
important.
topic. But what's the issue between life or death? I mean, we can argue about should there be a core history curriculum, but in reality, shouldn't sexual education be standardized? The person who's living in Virginia might be having intercourse with the person who grew up in Washington State. They should both have the same education.
Absolutely. And you bring up something else too, about the disparities in how information is actually given to students. So Eileen Fillercorn had legislation passed about consent, adding consent to the family life education here in Virginia, like teaching students, when yes is yes, when no is no, and when somebody's unconscious, that's not a yes. But how do you make sure 134 school boards have actually voted to put it in the curriculum? Who is writing the curriculum, and how do you know that the curriculum is being delivered to students in the classroom? So the accountability or the implementation is really very problematic, even if you have people who recognize the need for something like teaching consent.
Yeah, and one of the issues is, consent should be the foundation of all sexual intercourse. And the fact that that wasn't in our sexual education curriculum is just extremely telling. I mean, that should have been in it from the beginning. But then there is a lack of accountability measures. And if one teacher chooses not to teach a topic, 26 students are then out there who are 26 adults. And they're making questionable choices because they haven't been given the knowledge they need.
Well, and there's still astonishingly abstinence-only sex education. Like, we can sum up sex education in word. Don't do it. And that's not helpful. But it's legitimate. I mean, as you pointed out, there's a minority of states that actually mandate that this is taught at all.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think kids get out of an abstinence-only sex education? Do you think, and this is what, at the bottom of all of this, there are adults in decision-making positions who truly believe that if you teach about sex education, this is going to inspire or encourage or grant permission for students to have sex. Whereas teaching abstinence only clearly sends the message they should not be doing this. Is that reality-based, Hunter?
It's not reality-based, and I don't even really think you can call an abstinence-only sex education a sex education. I mean, if we're looking at the word education, you have to include a number of topics. You have to give students all of the knowledge and information that's out there. So you can't really call it an education if you're completely pulling a blind over their eyes regarding all of the other things that they're going to encounter within their sexuality. I mean, the studies from a recent study from the University of Georgia in 2011 showed that in almost every county that has an abstinence-only sexual education curriculum that they included in the study, teen pregnancies were higher.
Absolutely.
So, and I mean, the United States is the top developed country in the world for teen pregnancy and STD rates among adolescents. So it's not just a cultural stigma issue regarding teen pregnancies, it's a public health issue regarding STD spread.
Oh, absolutely. So for those of you who are just joining us, this is Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and we are talking to Hunter Wagenaar today about more inclusive sex education. So tell me a little bit about what you did at UVA in trying to establish a community of people who are interested in bringing this to the college community, to the university community.
Yeah, so originally I started with sort of a policy advocacy methodology regarding this issue. And so I came up with the name of Who's for Inclusive Sexual Education at UVA. We're Wahoo, so it's sort of a play off our school mascot, or HIGHs for short. And essentially, HIGHs just started to not only teach students about the topics that they may not have been taught about in high school sexual education, such as masturbation, like STD prevention, and LGBTQ identities, but also just teaching them how to advocate on the issue. So we've done a number of events that have sort of catered to that. Yeah, right now we started with 3 members. Right now we're at 32.
That's amazing.
And it really, I think it gives the LGBTQ community at UVA something to sort of rally around. A lot of other student groups are just sort of like pro LGBTQ rights, but this sort of gives them a single policy issue which they can rally around, which has such a large impact upon adolescents.
Oh, it does, and you make a good point. So, we were talking about a diverse community in Northern Virginia is, but at universities, people come from everywhere. They come from different places in the world, and it's the first time a lot of young people are living away from home. They're not living at home, which is, they make decisions all the time about sex and drugs and drinking, which is why a lot of students get into trouble because they're all coming from a different place. They're unsupervised for the first time. They're young adults. But, I love the fact that you've gone from 3 members to 32 members because it says there are people who recognize this is something we need to bring, first of all, to our own community. And then secondly, we need to address why people are arriving at university who really don't know the safe way to protect themselves. And the other thing is the mental health issues around all of this too. You touched on it. It's kind of like you're paranoid all the time, or you're concerned that you don't know enough to be healthy and safe. So as we talk a little bit more about this, how do we kind of tear down this idea that simply teaching evidence-based, scientific, medically accurate information is somehow going to harm children? How do we break down this idea that is really a mythology that boomers especially cling to?
Yeah, I mean it's very difficult, and I think that one of the things that gives me hope is one of the events that we had was the sort of sex ed progressive, which was on the historic lawn, and essentially students went around to different lawn rooms and learned about topics that weren't included in their sex ed. And towards the end of it, almost everyone who had participated and gone through for the whole 2-hour period came up to me and said, I've never really had a space where I can not only talk about sex and ask questions freely, but also just learn about topics such as this. And so that just shows me that although there may be those attitudes that are still lasting, I think they're just the loudest voices in the room and not the majority of the voices.
Clearly a generational issue. Young people, I think, are far more open about their sexuality. They're more comfortable in living their true, authentic selves. I think older people are not there, and some of them may never get there. But I do think that younger people are willing to stand up and say the word chlamydia and just know what it means and know why we should all be talking about it instead of saying, STDs and other vague sort of things that mask certain the thing about chlamydia is that there really aren't symptoms.
Yeah, I mean, 70% of individuals who have sexually transmitted diseases are asymptomatic, meaning they don't have them, which brings up the really important fact that you do need to get tested regularly and after every partner. And in my generation, people don't really know that. And so they also just don't know very specific facts regarding STD transmission. I mean, you can contract gonorrhea and chlamydia from receiving or giving oral sex, and most people don't really know that it can reside within the throat cavity. So you do need to get a throat swab if you're getting a sexually transmitted disease test. I mean, these are things that really aren't even included in our sexual education curriculums in school. So then how do you expect people to know them?
Right. And there's serious. So Michael Douglas, he is the celebrity that springs to mind because he had throat cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And he talked about this. He talked about the fact that they determined that the root of his throat cancer was, in fact, chlamydia. Right? And so I don't think people understand that this is not just get an antibiotic and cure your gonorrhea sort of thing. You touched on the fact that so many of these strains are becoming antibiotic resistant. We're getting these super strains. So withholding information is almost criminal to withhold this information from sexually active young people or people who will eventually be sexually active.
Yeah, some might say negligent. I mean, if you're not, one of the most common things regarding LGBTQ inclusive sex ed is parents will go, well, my child's not gay, so they don't need it. But how do you know?
Right.
I mean, there are individuals who come out at 32. There are individuals who come out at 23. There are individuals who come out at 12. You don't know whether your child's going to be gay, so how can you then exclude them from receiving that information?
And to me, it's like, sex education is sex education. Whatever community you might be in, the heterosexual one, the gay community, the bi community, and there's a lot of, we don't even really address bisexual people either. And that's a shame because there's a lot of bisexual people out there.
The other thing is asexuality. I mean, that's never touched upon within sexual education because in the ace community is one that's sort of just left behind because it's sort of in sexual education. It's like, oh, we're just going to teach about sex. But what about for those who don't want to engage in sex? And then they're feeling left behind because all their peers are going sex, sex, sex.
And they're going, what's wrong with me?
Yeah, what's wrong with me?
And I think you also touched on something important about the mental health aspect of all of this too. Like, how do kids know what they're experiencing or feeling or thinking about is normal or not normal? If nobody validates the fact that feeling however you're feeling is not unique to you. That there's all kinds of people who, young people are new. They are new. And so they're coming into this new. And if adults are not teaching them or validating the normal feelings and thoughts and experiences, it seems to me that it is negligent. I think you hit that it's negligent. My question is, how do we turn the tide on this? How do we get people to look at this from a different perspective?
Yeah, I think making it more engaging. I think that and really having resources available that are accurate, but also ones that adolescents want to go to. I mean, it's easy to just go to like a pornography site and like search something up and see something that isn't what really intercourse is, but also see like dangerous intercourse activity. It's easy to do that, but how do we make it easier for them to find resources that are more accurate and more engaging? And I think that's something that needs to be focused on much more. Like, we can go the policy route till the cows come home, but we talked about it earlier, even if you legislate something, how do you have those accountability measures within the classroom?
Yeah. So for those who might just be joining us, this is Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed. I'm talking with Hunter Wagenaar. I love that, 2 A's at the end. And he's third year at UVA, really advocating for a broader and more inclusive sex education curriculum. And going back to adolescents in our high schools who end up in our universities, many of them, things like conversion therapy, I think a lot of young people don't know what that is. I think a lot of adults don't know what that is. There's a lot of states that have actually passed legislation banning that. Mm-hmm. The psychiatric community here, and I'm going to be fuzzy on this, but there was a professional organization here in Virginia who, even though we don't have legislation banning it here, they came out saying that this was not good psychiatric therapy for young gay people. So do you want to explain what conversion therapy is and why, again, everybody should know what it is?
Yeah, well, I'm not an expert on it, and I've done some reading on it, but essentially it's sort of the mentality that you can sort of change someone's sexuality, which is extremely damaging. But I think what sort of the origin of it comes and how we might be able to sort of change that practice is allowing heterosexual adolescents to learn about LGBTQ identities as well.
Right. Does that not make sense?
Because if they don't hear about them and they don't hear about them and they don't hear about them and all of a sudden they meet an LGBTQ person.
How can that be normal?
It's shocking to them.
So we're not normalizing various sexualities. I think pop culture is helping a little bit. I think people went to see the movie Boy Erased or read the book Boy Erased, which is about conversion therapy. And so they have more of a familiarity about what it is and especially based in a lot of religious communities, because of their view about what they think the Bible says about homosexuality. But you're right. This needs to be just general information that everybody knows about. And it needs to be, and when we talk about it, we remove the stigma from it. I grew up in an era when if somebody you thought was gay, there was all kinds of euphemisms for it, right? And it was very difficult for families to figure out, and I think it still is. I think it still is. I think when young people come up to their families are still struggling with what is the appropriate thing to do. I mean, this was in my own family. when my husband's son came out, and Tom's like, and we took them to a dinner with his boyfriend, and Tom's like, do we introduce him as his boyfriend? I don't know if we should do that if we introduce. And then when Matt introduced his date as his boyfriend, Tom's like, oh, I think we can call him his boyfriend. And but that was not that long ago, maybe 5 years ago. And so even we as parents were like, we're not sure the right thing to say or the right thing to do, and we want to be, warm, loving parents who you treat all of our children like their lives and their choices are all fine.
Yeah. And I mean, that's the difficulty. I mean, if LGBTQ adolescents can't find the resources they need, how do we then expect their heterosexual parents to do that? I mean, it's a huge burden to place on the parent as well. It's like, how do you expect them to find all the information and resources for this? So I think that it should be the burden upon the school, but then we have to look at like, how do we do that?
Yeah, I think it's a major cultural question, and I think it's one that we're struggling with because this year, which is an off election year, every member of every school board is up for reelection, along with the board of supervisors and everybody in our House and Senate. So people who think they don't need to know about who their school board members are because their children aren't in school or they don't have kids to be in school, so why should they care who's on the school board? It's issues like this because the school board is in fact deciding, and the people in Richmond are deciding what goes into the curriculum.
And I think touching back on the sort of stigma issue, like this doesn't really have to be about LGBTQ inclusive sexual education solely. It can also be just about comprehensive sexual education. Why do male students not learn about menstruation?
Oh, you've hit one of my favorite topics. This radio show has covered that before. Yes, so Holly Seabold, who's an advocate with bras, said exactly the same thing. Did a show with she and Stella Pekarsky, who's running for the Sully District school board position. So boys and girls are separated into sex-segregated sex education. So boys aren't shown anything or told anything about menstruation because why should they know? They don't menstruate, right? Mm-hmm. But what that has led to is public policymakers who are predominantly men thinking that these items aren't essential, they should be taxed. It doesn't matter that they're not available where people need them, especially in public schools, coming back to the public schools. Holly's absolutely advocating for dispensers with these products for free in every restroom. And so let's talk about that. There are people who menstruate. We've gotten away from using feminine hygiene products to say menstrual hygiene products because there are people who are gender nonconforming, gendered fluid, gender non-binary, as well as transgender people. So you need these products wherever people need them when they need them, right? But we, on the menstrual equity front, are running into the same problem. How do you get people to care when they were never taught that in school? I mean, there's a stigma about discussing it. Men are like that. La 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 la. I don't want to la 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 la. I don't want to talk about that. So why can't we put these things? Why can't we put these very common sense things into family life education or sex education? You're asking me?
Yeah.
You're asking me?
I mean, yeah, and the other stigma we see, which isn't just within schools, it's across society, is one that the LGBTQ community is more promiscuous than their heterosexual counterparts. And that's simply not true. Yes, STD rates are disproportionately higher for LGBTQ individuals, but that's not because we're having more sex than heterosexual people. It's because we're not given the tools to know how to prevent STDs.
You're right. And in some communities, it's interesting, you talked about taking an LGBT Black literature course. And that's a community that has really struggled with accepting their LGBTQ members of the African American community. And so I think in some particular ethnic communities, you might find that the information's not there, that people are not practicing safe sex because they don't know how to do that, and there's not resources. If the resources are not in the school and it's not in your faith community and it's not at your home, you go on the website and all you find is really terrible porn. It's not even real.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just don't think people are thinking about sex education from this vantage point.
And also the individuals who often are recommending abstinence only are the most privileged.
Good point. Good point. And I sort of feel that way about the whole abortion issue as well. You know, they're shutting down all these abortion clinics and making all these draconian laws. But guess what? People who have privilege and money can buy whatever they want in this country. You want an abortion? You can buy that. It doesn't matter where you live if you've got money and you're privileged. What we're talking about is penalizing people who are poor and do not have access to resources.
Yeah.
Bottom line. So I'm glad that you brought that up because I think in all of this we do need to discuss why coming from a place of privilege and looking at this is very different coming from a marginalized community trying to address these particular needs. So we're going to go to a break, Hunter, but I want everybody to come back in a few minutes. We are talking with Hunter Wagenaar of UVA. He is an advocate for more inclusive sex education. This show is Making Change Radio, and I'm your host, Catherine Reed. So stay tuned if you're on the website or if you're on Channel 37, and rejoin us in just a minute.
Radio Fairfax. What you want to hear, where you want to hear it.
Hi, I'm Marianne Metz from The Melody Lingers On Radio Fairfax. Join me in exploring and enjoying the Great American Songbook. We bring back the wonderful voices of Rosemary Clooney, Bing Crosby, Ella Fitzgerald, Judy Garland, and Frank Sinatra, just to name a few. And we hear some who are still singing for us today. So come listen as the melody lingers on.
The Melody Lingers On every Wednesday at 11 a.m. only on Radio Fairfax.
Join Mike Delaney Wednesday evenings at 9 for a weekly meeting with the chairman of the board, a true American Idol, Mr. Francis Albert Sinatra. That's Simply Sinatra, Wednesday nights at 9 only on Radio Fairfax.
Tune in to the music that has shaped America's most dynamic art form called jazz. Join me, Robin Clemens, on Jazz at Club Paradise on Saturdays from 12 to 1 Eastern Standard Time. Listen in and hear recordings from the legendary masters of jazz and releases from young players who are taking the music forward. Join me, Robin Clemens, Jazz at Club Paradise on Saturdays from 12 to 1 Eastern Standard Time on Radio Fairfax.
Welcome to Isla Earth. To the world at large, global warming is anything but a game. But if you happen to be on the internet, it can be. That's where you'll find a game called Climate Challenge. Produced by the BBC, it lets you be president of the European nations. Your job as Prez is to pass environmental laws and react to crises caused by climate change, all the while staying popular enough with voters to remain in office. The data driving the game are actual climate change projections from 2006, provided by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and most of the policies players can work with came from real government policy documents. But the producers of the climate change game want to make sure people know it wasn't meant to accurately predict future events related to global warming. Their goal was to provide players with a fun and challenging way to learn more about the impact of climate change and options governments have for dealing with it. So next time you're online, why not give it a try? With all the insights you'll gain by playing, there's no way you won't be a winner. And the Earth, too. Plug in and play by following discovery links for today's program at islaearth.org. Isla Earth is produced by the Catalina Island Conservancy with support from its Fund for a Sustainable Planet, because Earth is an island.
Keeping the First Amendment alive. We are Radio Fairfax, Fairfax County's public access and internet radio station.
Welcome back to Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight I'm talking with Hunter Wagenaar, who is a third year at UVA, who is working on an initiative to really promote in public education a more inclusive sex education curriculum. I really appreciate you being here, Hunter. I am fascinated by what you're doing and the fact that for someone so young, you have taken on a huge, enormous project with the belief, and this is what I love about young people, with the belief that you really can make a difference, that you are going to make an impact. But then you come at this with a lot of personal experience. Like, you know, there's so many things we have not touched on, but part of what we're talking about is the cost in health and mental health to people versus prevention. Better information about how to prevent things like sexually transmitted diseases and other situations where you are trying to help somebody recover when they should not ever have been put in that position in the first place.
Yeah, and going into the costs, like I'm personally familiar at UVA, STD tests are not free. And at a number of other universities in the Commonwealth, they are. It's a huge issue our student council's been taking up. But personally, if I need to get tested, the student health center is the easiest and most efficient way to do that. But it's sort of a la carte per STD. So you have to be like, oh, I want to be tested for gonorrhea and HIV and chlamydia and syphilis. But, like, how crazy is that?
That
You
is
have to,
crazy.
I know.
And that's just the school policy, because you said these tests are free at some universities?
Yeah, I know at JMU, STD testing is free for all students, but at UVA, it just hasn't hit the mark.
It's so interesting to me because you would think that the health of your students would be paramount. Like, if that's not a priority, what's a priority?
Yeah, and well, additionally, if you can't pay for it, and then you have to ask your parents,
Well,
what if your
that's
parents don't even know if you're sexually active?
yeah.
So it disempowers students to make own decisions about what they're doing with their bodies, who they're having intercourse with, and how they're staying safe sexually.
And what do you think as far as medical professionals? Again, you know, I keep reminding people boomers are still running the world. It's not necessarily a great thing because they're not necessarily open to new information or a different perspective on the world. And so there's a lot of people in medicine who are treating people in the LGBTQ community who are not empathetic, sympathetic, or necessarily trained.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things you see is most of the training that surrounds LGBTQ individuals within medical school and residency is sort of around patient care. So, like, how do you interact with these individuals? But it's not necessarily informational on what health issues predominantly affect this community. How are you treating them? Those sorts of things. And so what you see is just sort of a gap in the care that LGBTQ individuals receive. Because don't you think that every doctor should be trained in how to deal with transgender individuals, like what health issues that they face predominantly? Because we shouldn't. Right now, what you see is a lot of doctors who specialize in transgender care, but really everyone should be able to.
It should be like standard medical practice.
It should.
Yeah, and there, and I have heard this at the TIES conference, which Equality Virginia has every year in October in Richmond, and transgender people and their families come to the TIES conference, and there's a lot of health information, a lot of legal information. This year it's going to be at the University of Richmond in October. But what we're hearing from people is there are doctors who will not treat them. They're simply doctors who will not take them as patients.
Yeah, I mean, that's just despicable. I mean, doctors are supposed to treat everyone
Everybody
equally regardless of who they are.
Right. But, again, probably 10 years ago, back when we were still debating, way before marriage equality, which people seem to think has solved everything, but it hasn't. But 10 years ago, a lot of people were like, well, they didn't know any gay people. Well, actually, they did know a lot of gay people. It wasn't safe to tell your family or your friends that you were gay. Now, it's kind of with marriage equality. One thing that marriage equality did do, it really opened up communications for people to be out in a different way that many people had not ever been out to their family or their friends or in the workplace or in their community. And so now there are very few people in this world probably who don't know someone who is gay. Mm-hmm. But with transgender individuals, especially with transgender children, this is where you see a lot of pushback from people going, I don't know what that means. I think it's made up. We shouldn't have boys in girls' bathrooms. And there's fewer people who know someone who's transgender. Although, again, I think with the spotlight on high-profile individuals who are transgender, like Laverne Cox.
Mm-hmm. Caitlyn Jenner.
People are starting to realize that people are choosing to live as their authentic selves.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're going to get more people pushing. You're going to get children in elementary school saying, I'm not the gender I was given on my birth certificate. And you still have people, teachers. You know, there was the case at West Point where a French teacher was fired. Boy, that divided the community, simply because this teacher would not use the pronouns of this transgender student, refused to do it. And then he was fired, and then the community's in an uproar like he should not have been fired. Really? Like, I mean, these are essential cultural battles that are happening at school board meetings and classrooms and faith communities. You know, how do you see over the next 5 years giving this message, or you know, you're the one who's advocating for more inclusive sex education. How do we help people understand transgender?
Yeah, and I think going on to the cases of misgendering and utilizing the wrong pronouns, I mean, within the HIES curriculum and what we advocate for at UVA, we say that that's an act of violence because you're knowingly being ignorant of someone's complete identity. You're essentially reducing them to nothing because you're not recognizing who they are. But one of the interesting things that we also talk about in our curriculum, which some people haven't even talked about, it's something that's really not even talked about, is within intercourse, most people just think you really need to learn another person's sexuality. But it's also important to learn about their gender identity and gender expression, because there are certain things that you can do within sexual intercourse that affirm someone's gender identity or gender expression. And so it's really important to not only know their sexuality, but their gender, because the two aren't
separate.
A dichotomy. They're separate. They're completely separate.
And that was sort of a basic thing to help people understand, you know, gender identity. You know, your biological sex is what's between your legs. Your gender identity is what's between your ears. It's how you think of yourself, how you know yourself, how you see yourself. And then sexual orientation is different from that.
Mm-hmm.
So you're really...
And then you even have romanticism. So you even have individuals who may be asexual but biromantic. So they don't feel like they're not sexually active, but they can have romantic relationships with men and women. So there's so many layers.
Right. And young people are not being taught in school that these things are actually normal because other people feel this way. There's communities of people.
And I mean, it's difficult, I think, especially for sort of the boomer mindset, because everything was so simple. It was just two things.
Right. You were this or that.
You were this or that. And it was easy to sort of divide and then like villainize people. But now there's so many different swaths of options that it's sort of like...
Right. But getting back, it's normal. So for those of you who are just joining us, this is Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and Hunter Wagenaar is really helping us to understand what young people need in sex education to affirm who they are. And at the basic bottom line, what we need is something that affirms their safety, but also their mental health, right? I think when adults think that just by not talking about, well, we're not going to teach about this, because you know how people of a certain age feel. If you tell them something, you're basically putting this idea in their head that they didn't already have. I mean, am I saying that? Is that what you have found?
I mean, yeah. I mean, that's a certain perspective. But then if you go into it, how did I become gay? Because I wasn't taught about gay relations within my sexual education.
But non-gay people don't believe that, right?
No.
You just turn people gay. I mean, there are people who are like, well, if you teach them that, you'll turn people gay. If you talk about, you know, transgender people, you'll turn people transgender. I mean, people literally think that.
Yeah. And I mean, it follows that same like horrible vein of conversion therapy. They think they can unteach it, but that's simply not the reality.
So I think the idea that we have to get across, and I really do think that this has to be talked about, you know, when we talk about school board members who are running for office and their worldview on things like this. In a classroom, you have people from many different backgrounds. And in Northern Virginia, that's many different ethnic backgrounds. But sitting in those chairs are young people working out their identity, not just their ethnic identity or the identity that exists on so many levels about how we see ourselves in terms of class or religion or privilege, but they're trying to sort out who they are. And they're not getting anything in a curriculum that affirms the fact that whatever it is that they're feeling, that's okay. You're okay. Who you are, totally fine, because it's not just you. There are communities of other people out there. And I don't know how we can, drive home the point that this is a mental health issue as much as the safety and well-being for physical health. And that's the other thing I don't see adults really wrapping their minds around. Non-information puts children at risk, puts young people at risk, puts young adults at risk.
Yeah, and I mean, going to the mental health risks, I mean, suicide rates within the LGBTQ community are highly disproportionate when you look at heterosexual counterparts. And what I think it comes down to is an issue of isolation, because they feel that they're alone in their struggle with their identity and who they are. And if you're not addressing that in sexual education, but additionally within other curriculums, I mean, if you're not talking about LGBTQ individuals within history curriculums.
Literature.
Yeah.
History, literature. I mean, LGBT individuals have always been with us. What it is that we don't know who they are, and we don't talk about their accomplishments or their contributions.
Yeah, and so it's a lack of inclusivity across the board, but then when you're looking at those huge impacts and huge consequences, it comes from sexual education, because if you're not making it inclusive, then those LGBTQ students aren't getting the tools they need.
So let's talk about HIV. So I was actually around in the 1980s when this mystery disease started taking disproportionate numbers of gay men. And the United States was incredibly slow to respond to an epidemic. A generation of men were lost. And it was the gay disease, and we still have HIV. And now and people understand what it is and how it's transmitted. But, the opioid epidemic, which has led to a heroin epidemic, has led to people getting HIV who are not even in this community. But we're still not addressing the prevalence, how prevalent it still is.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest issues is within my sexual education, and still within Fairfax County Public Schools, pre-exposure prophylaxis, which is PrEP for short, which can prevent exposure to HIV it can prevent transmission if you're exposed to it, is not included within the curriculum. So how do you expect LGBTQ, and that's in one of the most progressive counties in the country, how do you expect LGBTQ individuals to even know that it's an option?
Especially young people. I mean, think about doctors, and some pediatricians actually treat kids up to the age of like 21. But if they are not addressing prevention measures or options like PrEP, how is that benefiting young people? My gut instinct tells me it's because doctors are like, well, if I give you PrEP, you are going to be this promiscuous, wild, irresponsible, dangerous person. Don't you think that's really what's at the bottom of that?
I mean, I don't even know. I don't even know that. I can't get into the minds of people
that are kind of old like me. I can.
But with additionally, they won't advertise PEP, which is post-exposure prophylaxis, which is if you've been or believe you've been exposed, and it prevents transmission. So there's sort of this just like expectation for the gay community to just know everything. And doctors and teachers and parents don't have to tell them anything, which it's
like people stumbling around in the dark.
Yeah,
and then you wonder why people get hurt. Like, oh, a terrible thing happened, but it was because people were wandering around in the dark with no information. I know that there's a lot of people in the LGBTQ community who think that rules around donating blood need to be changed, that's outdated. Like, when AIDS happened, it's like, well, if you're gay, you can't give blood. And like, we're way past that. Everybody's blood gets tested, right? Everybody's. Yeah. Mine, everybody's. So why do we still have this outdated policy?
Well, I think it's just that stigma that we talked about earlier, that LGBTQ individuals are more promiscuous. But then if the opioid crisis is happening and
yeah.
and HIV rates are raising for the heterosexual community as well, then why isn't there
Oh yeah, blood
more
donation
restriction?
policy.
Yeah.
Like if you've
No
ever
one gives blood ever.
yeah, which is not helpful because we need people to donate blood. But I do think that stigma, we keep coming back to the stigma, to outdated ideas, to a mythology that people believe is true. And what I like to say is that, just because a lot of people believe something's true doesn't mean it's true. It means a lot of people believe something's true. And that's where I think we are with sex education. And the harm that people think sex education does over the harm of not giving students factual, medically accurate information.
Yeah, and I think it also goes into the epidemic of sexual assault that we're facing within our country. I mean, with the Me Too movement and that whole swath of allegations that have come out.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, if students aren't taught about consent,
So
then
let's talk about Jeffrey Epstein for a minute. Might as well. Everybody else is. He trafficked girls, 14 and 15-year-old girls. He paid people to recruit them out of high schools. These girls were living at home and engaging in this while they were living at home and taking money. Right? But adults don't see that, not teaching human trafficking, not teaching what that is to 14 and 15-year-olds as more dangerous than not teaching them about it at all.
yeah. And I mean, it's in the adolescent mindset, like you might not think it's assault in the moment because you haven't been told what assault is. You haven't been taught what consent is. So then once you do realize 5-10 years later, you realize, oh my God, I have been assaulted. And then people come out and they're bashed in the media. They're bashed by the person that assaulted them. And I mean, let's look at the mental health effect of that.
Oh, I know. Savannah Guthrie did an interview with a young woman who just felt so guilty. First of all, because she blamed herself. She thought somehow all of this was her fault. Well, she's 14, How does a 14-year-old mind work? And then the fact that she didn't come forward. And because she didn't come forward, many, 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 many other girls were assaulted because she did not tell somebody. So if you're just joining us, it's Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed. And I'm talking with Hunter Wagenaar, who is discussing more inclusive sex education, really making a very strong case for why this is critically important and why we need to be talking about this now in Virginia, in Fairfax County, because there are young people who are at risk in so many ways. And, moving forward, I know that you are working on a curriculum, an actual curriculum that you think is more inclusive. And I'm sure that since this is a nascent project, there you have a long way to go to figure out how you'll roll it out and what communities you'll contact or where you expect to find support. What is kind of your timeline on this? I mean, you do have to go back to school.
Yes, I do. So we're hoping to have the first parts of our curriculum, i.e. consent, because it's the foundation of all intercourse, done mid-fall, which is, a little too overzealous, I might say. But
Very ambitious, very ambitious.
Yeah, but by the spring, we're hoping to actually roll it out to some parents and communities and see the effect that it has. Sort of circling back on consent and what we might include in that curriculum. It's so important to talk about consent within the LGBTQ community because within that community, assault rates are higher, sexual assault rates are higher. But within the heterosexual community, it's somewhat stigmatized who gives consent within a sexual relationship. Sort of the woman gives consent. But if it's man, who gives consent? If it's woman, who gives consent? This is where there's no real standard, not even within the sexual education community, of how we engage in teaching that and what the standard is. Who does give consent?
And that's what you bring to it that a lot of other people who develop curriculum don't bring to it. And that's lived experience, right?
Yeah. I mean, we're students teaching students. The majority of the individuals I'm reaching out to and the stakeholders are LGBTQ 19 and 20-year-olds who just went through a sexual education that was inadequate. And seeing what they think should be included, I think really helps in building a curriculum that is inclusive of everyone, regardless of their racial background or their sexual identity.
I think you're absolutely right. So people who want to help you with this, support you in this, give you feedback on this? Is there a way once you have something to show that you could ask a community, the broader community, to review it, look at it, give you feedback?
Yeah, so I think that looking what we're aiming to do this school year actually is going to get away from a biased sample size. I've often been we've often been going to the LGBTQ community and asking their input, but I'd like to actually go to the Interfraternity Council and the Intersorority Council at UVA and use our consent curriculum there and see how they interact with it, what they think of it. Sexual assault is a huge issue within the Greek community. There was the Rolling Stone article at UVA. Huge things happen on college campuses. So I think it's extremely important to move towards that, to create a more comprehensive consent curriculum. And I think that's a good community to go to sort of test it out.
And what about specifically looking at communities of color? Because a lot of them just culturally have a much more difficult time sometimes within their communities in figuring out how to access information, how to access services, or even how to come out. I've heard so many of my LGBTQ friends talk about you don't ever come out once.
Yeah.
You come out all the time, every time you meet somebody, every time you're in a situation. There's so many people who are still not out in the workplace.
Yeah.
Really, 2019.
And I mean, there's no protections for them federally.
Or in the state of Virginia either. The Commonwealth of Virginia has no protections for employment, housing, or public accommodation. And a lot of people don't realize that either, and which is the other reason that people don't come out.
Yeah.
But I think with younger people, we have a tremendous opportunity to simply change the culture and to normalize and destigmatize what it means to be in the LGBTQ community. I think a lot of people right now are struggling with the very idea of non-binary or gender fluid. The use of pronouns like they, them, and theirs, which sounds awkward to a lot of people. Even when people say, I prefer they, them, and theirs. I struggle with it because it's just you have to get your mind around using those instead of the he, she pronouns.
Yeah, and what I mean, I'm a resident advisor, and one of the sort of things I always say to my residents is the amount of effort it takes you to put into changing those pronouns in conversations, although it may be difficult to start off, has a profound impact on the individual that you're using them to, because you're affirming their identity. And I mean, that gets down to the root of what being a human being is affirming others. And so it's so important. It is difficult early on to get into that, but I think it's so important.
And I think people will. I was talking to my oldest daughter about this, and she goes, I'm a gamer. And in the gaming community, that's what we do, because people have their names. Nobody really knows who anybody is in a game. So they use gender-neutral pronouns. And I never thought of that. She goes, yeah, that's just what we do. Mm-hmm. Because you don't know anybody's gender. Yeah. Like you're playing a game and you have a character name. And I'm like, all right, so that's a good mindset. Other people have suggested other ways of practicing, how to do that. And it's worthwhile. And you're right. We need to affirm people for who they are. Teaching young people as part of their school experience that they are accepted, they are valued, and whoever they are is okay.
Yeah.
It's more than okay.
And I think it goes into starting to do it yourself. So if it, I'll always say under my email signature, it says he, him, his. And I'll always, all of our highs organization chapter meetings, we start off with name, best part of your week, and pronouns. Because I just think it's so important to get into the routine. And then it makes it easier for individuals who might assume someone's pronouns. Now, then they know because they've said them.
And I've interviewed people several times on my show, on Inside Scoop and on Your Need to Know, who are like, well, I'm using gender neutral pronouns because I just don't feel like I can be one or the other anymore. I just don't feel like that's something I want to do. I don't want to be she, or I don't want to be he. I want to be them, theirs, they. And so when you're interviewing somebody, that's not a problem. What I find is when I do the summary, it's going back and gender neutralizing everything and summarizing an interview. That's not really hard. It's really not hard. It's just changing your mindset and also prioritizing being affirming to other people. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I applaud you. This is a big, big thing you're taking on. But I appreciate the fact that you came through Fairfax County Public Schools. You went through this curriculum firsthand. You're on a college campus with other LGBTQ youth, and you realize what the problems are. So you go back to school in the fall.
Mm-hmm.
I want to have you back on the show too, because I think that everybody,
I'd love to, yeah.
because I think people want an update, and I'm firmly in your corner. I think you've got you are the person we've been waiting for to lead us, because I haven't heard from anybody else who wants to take this on, even though it's so critically important.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine.
Well, thank you. It was, and I have to give a shout out to Debbie Lane. Debbie Lane, who introduced the two of us, and this is the importance of making introductions, and also the fact that she is on your board.
Mm-hmm.
And
she's my curriculum expert. Yep.
She is, and so shout out to Debbie Lane for that. And I want to thank everybody who joined us here tonight. If you want more information, it's not hard to find. Who's for Inclusive Sex Education? Hunter's not difficult to find either. And if you're interested in raising this issue, reach out to the members, reach out to the people running for school board. That would be my suggestion. If this issue matters to you and you think it's as critically important as Hunter and I think it is, then you need to bring this up at school board debates, school board forums. You need to read school board members' websites. You know, this is where Hunter found that that some people use sodomy still. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been Making Change Radio.